Hello, everyone. Welcome to our small group series, Reading Genesis with Jesus. For our small group introductions, I am pleased to welcome Dr. Andrew Steinman, who is the Distinguished Professor of Hebrew and Theology at Concordia University, Chicago. And I have in my hands Dr. Steinman's recent commentary on the book of Genesis, and I've had the opportunity to absorb large portions of this myself. It is a wonderful, wonderful resource for the church, and just so happy to welcome Dr. Steinman.
Well, always good to be here and
Yeah.
have a little conversation.
Yes, we are going to have a little conversation, and the way this is going to work for our small group gatherings is we're going to have a little talk here, and we're going to talk about some of the things that Dr. Steinman considers to be noteworthy about these parashat, these sections that we're looking into. We're not going to cover everything in each one, because we've got roughly 5 chapters per section. That's a lot of Genesis. I'm sure Dr. Steinman could spend a lot more time than what we're going to spend on each one. But we're gonna take little nuggets, and hopefully it'll be something to get you talking together about God's Word and diving a little deeper into it. So let's get started with what I think is clearly a passion for Dr. Steinman, and that is seeing Jesus in Genesis. And of course, like at the time, nobody really knows it's going to be Jesus. We know that there is a Messiah, there's an anointed one who is coming. And in this first section, all the way up through chapter 5-ish, where do you see the Messiah most clearly, and what really gets you about that section?
Well, I think the foundational passage about the Messiah in the entire Old Testament comes in Genesis chapter 3 after the fall. Mm-hmm. And we have this curse that's put on Satan. And Satan is told that there's going to be hostility between him and the woman, Eve, mm-hmm. and between his descendants, his seed, it says, which is the Hebrew word for descendants, mm-hmm. and her seed, her descendant. And the reason I take that as singular is because then, in the next sentences, the seed of the woman is referred to in the singular. He, right? Not mm-hmm. they. It's not about all the descendants of the woman, but about a particular descendant of the woman. And it says that Satan will strike at his heel, a reference that we see further blossom in the New Testament at Jesus' crucifixion, mm-hmm. but he will crush Satan's head. And for centuries, ever since the earliest Christians, this has been called the first gospel. Of course, they call it that in Latin, but we'll call it first gospel
sure.
in English.
Yes.
And it's such the foundational passage because out of it flows all the other messianic passages, not only in Genesis, but then throughout the entire Old Testament. And so even though, it gives us very little specifics about the Messiah, we know that this was the promise given to our first parents, mm-hmm. and this was the hope that they had. That their hope is not any different than ours. It's just a different perspective. They're looking for someone to come.
Yep.
We're looking back at someone who came.
Yeah.
So we're looking at it from a different angle than they were, but we're looking at the same person.
Yeah.
And that's why it's such an important passage, because we know that from the very beginning, God had this plan for human beings to redeem them. And that we can be reassured that God had this plan all along. It wasn't just something he did on the fly. Mm-hmm. So this passage in Genesis 3 is the, if I can use the word, seminal passage.
Sure. That would be a very appropriate thing with the word seed there.
Yes.
Now, you then begin to trace that word seed throughout Genesis. Can you comment just a little bit on how we get this singular seed, but then we start to see how one generation moves to the next.
Yeah, and the word seed occurs more often in Genesis than anywhere else in the Old Testament. Okay, and it's used again, for instance, in promises to Abraham, which we'll talk about in future sessions, where Abraham is promised a seed.
Mm-hmm.
And just like English, the word seed can be a collective, like when I put out bird seed to feed the birds, right? I don't mean one single seed.
Yes.
I mean a collective bunch of seeds. But it can also mean a single one,
Yeah.
right? So Hebrew's just like English with that word. And so you have to be careful in this passage. Is it referring to a bunch of descendants of Abraham? And sometimes it is.
Mm-hmm.
Abraham's seed are going to get the land of Canaan, right? That's a plural. But sometimes the promise is to a singular seed.
Yeah.
And Abraham is promised, for instance, that in him all the nations of the earth will be blessed. That comes through his singular seed in Jesus.
That's fascinating.
So we see this seed theme playing itself out throughout the book of Genesis, and it becomes one of those words that Genesis keeps on bringing up time and time again and kind of teasing the reader.
Mm-hmm.
Is it singular
Mm-hmm.
or is it collective?
Well, that's good.
And we have to look closely at each context and each passage to see where it is and where it isn't.
Yeah. Yeah. And then, of course, Paul's going to pick that up later in Galatians and talk about the singular seed, the plural seed, and all of that stuff. So it is such an important piece. So my second question for you is something we're going to do every time. Actually, all of these questions we're going to ask each time. But you get this deeper perspective on all of these books of the Bible, just because you have the gift to dive into the original language and do all of the research there. And as you look at these first few chapters of Genesis, what's something that you consider to be awesome or fascinating or just noteworthy that you come across because of your study, but may not be something that we would see necessarily on the surface?
Yeah, I think there's something already in chapter 1 that it's easy. It's there in English and also in Hebrew, and it's easy to read over. But it's something you need to really pay attention to. And that is, in Genesis 1, God both creates and makes.
Mm.
Now, it's easy to read and say, well, make, create, it's two different words for the same thing.
Sure.
And in some sense, that's true. But the word for create in Hebrew is a very special word. In the entire Old Testament, every time that word comes up, the subject, the person doing the action, is always God.
Okay.
We can talk in English, about I created a masterpiece when I, did this or that or the other thing. But not in Hebrew. Only God creates in Hebrew. And it occurs 3 times in that first chapter. And every other time it just says God made, which, of course, in Hebrew, just like in English, people can make things, God can make things, so that's not quite the same thing. So the question is, why does the Genesis use create?
Uh-huh.
And it does it in 3 instances. God creates the heavens and the earth, verse 1. God creates the animals later on. And then God creates human beings. Now, why does it use create those 3 spots and everywhere else just say He made? He made the plants, He made the sun, the moon, the stars, but He created things. Well, I can't actually prove, but I think I know why.
Okay.
Whenever God makes something that didn't exist previously in Genesis 1, Moses uses the word create.
Yeah.
So nothing existed before God created the heavens and the earth.
Sure.
Well, then He makes the seas. He's just reforming what He created. He brings plants out of the earth. He's just reforming the earth. But then He gets to animals. Later on, days 5, 6, He's making animals and He creates. Well, we learn if we read carefully in Genesis later on that animals are special, different than plants from the viewpoint of Moses and his writing, is that animals have what is called the breath of life in them.
Mm-hmm.
Nothing before that time had the breath of life. So he's creating something that's unique.
Yeah.
And then he gets to human beings. And he creates human beings. And he uses the word create several times. In his image he created them. Male and female he created them. Right? And it's this image of God that no other creation of God has, that human beings have. So every time that God brings forth something new, the word create is used in Genesis 1. Now that's not always true in the Old Testament. He can use create and not bring forth something new.
Mm-hmm.
But in Genesis 1, it appears as if Moses is using this word to kind of say to the reader, be on alert. There's something new here. Mm-hmm. There's something unique that hadn't existed before this. So it's a little bit of a nerdy thing, and it's easy to read over. But I think it's important because he's saying animals are different than what came before. And human beings are different even than the animals. Mm-hmm. And we can talk about ourselves as animals because we share certain things with them. But we have something the animals don't have. And that's the image of God.
Yeah.
And so that's what makes, I think, the creation of human beings the crown of Genesis chapter 1. Mm-hmm. Is because God endows human beings at the creation with this image of God that the animals don't have. And I always try to tell my students this image of God business is really serious. God makes things and then he labels them. He said, let there be light. And then he labeled the light day and the darkness night. Mm-hmm. And I tell my students, we have to label everything too. We create this thing.
Sure.
Just recent memory, these things.
Yep.
And we couldn't just call them a thingamabob.
Yeah.
Right? We had to have a word for it. We had to come up with cell phone, mobile phone,
sure,
something to describe it. We label things. We can't have a child and say, well, I'll just call it you. Hey, you, right? We have to give it a name. It's Susie or Earl or something like that. Sure. It's a reflection of how deeply the image of God, I think, is attached to us human beings.
Fascinating. So then, we, made in the image of God, we don't create.
No.
We're never in that position. We're never the origin of things. We're always in the position to make. Right, and that very much is the part of the purpose, right? God puts us into the world, makes us in His image, and then says, "Go make stuff."
Yeah,
and
He authorizes us to do those things, but we might be in God's image, but we're never God.
It's right. It's right. It's the image. There's a difference, right? That's awesome. That's awesome. So one last question here, and really the purpose for looking at Genesis right now, other than just the cool thing about reading Genesis at the same time that Jesus would have, is that I feel like our world really needs us to get back to some foundational things. And our Christian people need to go back and find and discover and really fall in love with those foundational things. And it's a very real thing for us. The everyday life that we have. So here's a final question. As you're looking at these first few chapters of Genesis, what do you find there that is a message that our people just really need to hear?
Well, I think in today's age, where we have a lot of questions about sexuality going on, in the first chapter and the second chapter, we get the creation of Adam and Eve. And chapter 1 especially emphasizes God created them male and female. Mm-hmm. And in chapter 2, it emphasizes God's gift of marriage. And we've had, unfortunately, over 100 years now trying to tell people that they're just random processes that brought you about.
Yeah.
No. If you were created male, that's God's gift to you. If you were created female, that's God's gift to you. And the question is, do you want to use God's gift as He designed it, or not. Now, certainly we need to have compassion on people who, because of factors in our world, find themselves trying to do things with their sexuality that God did not design. They struggle with those things, and the church needs to speak to them both in love, but also with the truth. We need to, if we can, redeem them from that through the power of God's Holy Spirit and His holy word. But we cannot compromise what God has done as faithful people of God. I think we need to say, God created me, either male or female, and that's His gift to me, and I need to use that gift according to His design. I need to be a faithful man or woman according to God's design. That means honoring marriage, whether I'm married or whether I'm single. That means if I am married, that to be the best husband or wife I can be, the best father or mother I can be, because God created marriage, therefore He also created family. And I think that is a foundational thing in these first chapters, that marriage and family are God's gift to us. They're not just some social convention that we human beings came up with.
You know, I think about all the detail that went into God's creation, all of the things that could have been mentioned specifically in Genesis, right? I mean, just look at the complexity. Science is always revealing all sorts of complexities in the world, and yet God chose to say this one, that He created them male, He created them female, and you're gonna have a lifetime together. And that's definitely mentioned there. I really appreciate that. What would you say to someone who is struggling in this? Maybe they're struggling with it themselves. Maybe they have friends or family members, and they're trying to figure out, like, okay, yeah, maybe this is true, but how do I do this? How do I talk about it? How do I bring this up? What does Genesis mean to me?
I think Genesis means that we have to deal both with the truth and with an eye to how do we love these people who are doing the wrong thing, or who have temptations to do the wrong thing. Just as we might deal with someone who has a temptation to steal, right, or who has a temptation to curse, or to break any of the other commandments. This is not the unforgivable sin, but I think Genesis calls us to see this is something we can, in a very loving way, say, we understand you're struggling with this because you have a family member who is, or you yourself are. And we are not trying to persecute you. We're not seeking your life. We're not trying to make your life miserable. But what we are trying to do is make your life the fullest it can be under God's gift to you in creation.
Yeah, and I think that's a beautiful perspective to have. And I think it's really easy for us to go down another path and choose to be judgmental. And I think what you're describing is very much the path God wants us to take, and certainly what Jesus has taught us as well. Well, I want to thank you so much for spending some time. I think the table is set for everyone to have a great conversation. So, small groups, have at it. See you next time.